So when I was in high school, our family had this black Oldsmobile, and it had a tendency to stall at the most inopportune times. Usually on a busy highway, as we were crossing the road, the car would just stall. And my mother would have the keys in her hand, and she would be turning the key to get the car to start. And she would be praying, "Please, God, please let the car start." And I would be looking at her, and then I would turn my head and I would look at the cars driving about 60 miles an hour right at us. And I would say, Mom. And thinking, well, at what point do you abandon the car? You know, it's like you're stuck on a train track. At what point do you just say, this isn't working for us? We need to try something different, because driving this car across this road is endangering our lives on a daily basis. I don't know if you've ever had an experience like that, where something important breaks down. And maybe it's the car that won't start, but maybe it's the oven that quits on Thanksgiving morning. And you've got 25 relatives headed over for dinner in 3 hours. Or the lawnmower won't start, and, well, the neighborhood homeowners association is voting on best lawn. And it doesn't have to be technology or mechanics. You wake up and your arm hurts, and you were planning on doing something outdoors, or you were having trouble going to sleep, and you have a huge presentation the next day, or your foot feels like it's broken, and you just reached the bottom of the Grand Canyon. Life can be frustrating because things break. And when they break spectacularly, that's when frustration turns sour. All the hopes you had for the perfect marriage is gone. Your dream job becomes drudgery. Your family life is blown up because one of its members has an life-altering addiction. A couple of months ago, Becky and I were in Juneau, Alaska on a Sunday. We visited this little church in Juneau, and it was we kind of just Googled churches. We were in Port, and it's a Sunday, and what do you do on Sunday? You go to church. So we found Douglas Island Bible Church, and we hired a cab. The most ornery, hateful cab driver you'll ever meet. Very unhappy. So we got there. We had a good time. I took the family of like 14 to lunch. This couple has a bunch of kids. We all went to lunch, bought them pizza. We had a great time. And then they drove us around their area, and we got to a bridge where the Mendenhall River runs under the bridge. And he stopped the van. I'm sorry, they drive a bus. I'm not making this up. They drive a bus. I told you, big family. And we got out of the bus, and he said, "This is what was on the news last week." You might remember from a couple of months ago in Juneau, the Mendenhall River was overflowing its banks, and trees were falling into the river, and homes were falling into the river. And we were thinking about just right over there, and we saw some homes that were kind of on the edge of falling into the river, and people lived there just before, and now their home is gone. Your washer dryer breaking is frustrating. Your house toppling into a river? Waking up with a headache is frustrating. Waking up with glioblastoma, that's brain cancer, something else. And because we all live in a sin-cursed world, right? All of creation is groaning in travail and pain together until now. Because we live in that world, there is much melancholy to life. We grow old and our bodies stop working. We lose relationships we once cherished. Children leave the home and never call as much as you hoped they would. The job market dries up for those overqualified 60-plus-year-olds. That's why Longfellow wrote, "In every life some rain must fall. Some days must be dark and dreary." Of course, Longfellow knew what he was talking about. His first wife, Mary, died during a miscarriage. His second wife, Frances, was killed after her dress caught fire. The burns to his face he got trying to save her, he covered with a beard, which is why he grew his beard. Longfellow knew what it was to live in a dark and dreary day. And you do too. And of course, our psalmist did too. He knew well that, number one, life's troubles can lead us to blame God. Now, an honest assessment. I am being crushed down. Verse 15, my shame, my confusion is before me. The shame of my face has covered me. For the voice of him that reproaches and blasphemes by reason of the enemy and the avenger. Verse 22, for your sake we are killed all the day long. We are accounted as sheep for the slaughterhouse. Verse 25, our soul is bowed down to the earth. Our belly crawls on the earth. The psalmist here says, there are three reasons for my assessment. National Israel had suffered a great military defeat, verses 9 and 10. They had been sent into some sort of exile or some sort of judgment in verses 11 and 12, although this isn't the big exile. And they were being mocked by national neighbors, verses 13 and 14, which leads to this emotional response in the verses I just read. When everything kind of turns negative, isn't it easy to feel ashamed or at least a little embarrassed when you go out and you know everybody's looking at you? Or when your life is genuinely in jeopardy. And you say, I feel lower than something that crawls on the ground, like a snake crawling on its belly. I feel lower than that. That's an honest assessment of many people who claim to be followers of Jesus today. This was the psalmist's own assessment of himself. Then, of course, he came to a personal evaluation. Even as he said, I feel like I'm being crushed, he said, this is not something I deserve. He says, verse 17, all of this has come upon us, but we haven't forgotten God. Verse 17, we haven't dealt falsely in his covenant. Our hearts did not turn back, neither did our steps decline from his way. Verse 20, if we have forgotten the name of God or stretched out our hands to a strange God, shall not God search this out? For he knows the secrets of the heart. The psalmist claims not to warrant such sufferings. He's saying, honestly, I'm looking at my life and saying, there's nothing that I have done that deserves this. This is like what Job is going through. I don't know why all of these things have come upon me, but I just lost my fortune. I just lost my family. I just lost the popularity or the influence of leadership I had in my community. My own wife is telling me to curse God and die. I have lost my health. I've lost everything. That's what it seems like. I don't deserve this. And I think that's something many people can say, boy, I identify with that. In fact, he uses the phrase, forgotten the Lord, to express his innocence. He says, I haven't forgotten the Lord in terms of covenant faithfulness. The people were keeping the covenant. Their hearts were with God. They were living for him. He concludes, we weren't even being idolatrous. We didn't go serve other gods. We didn't stretch forth our hands to false gods. He argues and he says, God knows this is true. This is why I don't believe this is the main exile of the whole nation of Israel. This is likely one of the other judgments of God. And if you read those Old Testament stories, you often find that the judgments of God came upon the children of those who had sinned earlier. In fact, how many times do you read the little phrase, and he was happy when he found out it would not happen in his lifetime? It's kind of a weird thing to think about. And so naturally, if you feel like life is just kind of pushing you down and crushing you down, and that's an honest assessment of yourself, and then you are thinking and saying, I'm evaluating myself because this is what believers do, and you say, okay, I'm feeling crushed down, but I do not deserve this. I can't look in my life and say, here's the sin, there's the sin that I did that brought me to this place. Then there is a logical, can I say wrong, conclusion that we often reach when we say, it's God's fault. And this is exactly what the psalmist says. Look at verse 9. You cast us off. You put us to shame. You're not going forth with our armies. You make us turn back from the enemy and them that hate us and spoil us for themselves. You gave us like sheep appointed for meat. You scattered us among the heathen. You sell your people. You sell us into slavery for nothing, and you don't become any wealthier, God, for doing it. You make us a reproach to our neighbors, a scorn and derision to those around about us. You make us a byword. We become a swear word among the heathen, a shaking of the head among the people. Though you have sore broken us in the place so that we are like a place for dogs, for jackals to live, just a place so destroyed that the wild animals are taking over. And you covered us in the shadow of death. Verse 24, why? Why did you hide your face from me? Where are you, God? Remember, a car doesn't start, that's frustrating. But an accident in a car that's not your fault, and now you can't walk, or you can't work, or worse, a loved one is killed. And let me tell you, especially when you say, I haven't sinned, this isn't something I've done, and God brought this on me. It's very easy to slip right into the logical but wrong conclusion and just say, God, it's your fault. You control everything, right? You're sovereign over the whole earth, right? It's your fault. Why would you do this? Why would you bring this on me? Boy, the Psalms are pretty practical, aren't they? Because the psalmist thinks himself to be vindicated, he says God must be to blame. So God cast him off. God put him to shame. God didn't go with him to war. God didn't turn back in defeat. You know what the psalmist is saying? He's saying, God, you're not keeping your promises. You're not doing what you said you would do. You caused our national shame. You turned our home into a den of jackals. You're hiding from us. You're forgetting us. So just to be clear, if you're reading this psalm and you're reading it exactly as it's being written, the psalmist is entirely blaming God for his situation. But that is the wrong conclusion. I think it's the wrong conclusion because he's been way too generous on his own and personal and national faithfulness. Every time we get complaining like this with God, when we say we don't deserve this, we forget that, you know what, we deserve much worse than this. We forget that without God and without Jesus, we'd have hell as our home. And we become way too overly critical of God as being unfair. But I think it's helpful when we see something like this, especially when it's written by inspiration of God, to realize what God is doing here in this text is bringing to mind the very thoughts that we ourselves have had so that we can in turn recognize what's wrong with these thoughts and turn from them. So can we just admit for a moment that sometimes we're tempted to think like this? Don't you think it's helpful? The lady who wants to get pregnant and she's getting older and it's miscarriage after miscarriage after miscarriage. Don't you think she's thinking, God, this is a little unfair? Or the lady who has 10 kids and gets pregnant with number 11, maybe she's saying, God, this is unfair. I don't know. That maybe is a two-edged sword. The truth is, it's very easy to look at your situation and say, you know, I don't deserve this. Did we deserve that car accident? It wasn't my fault. And now I have the bills and the injuries and the damage. And what did I do to cause me to get sick? I'm not eating a Snicker bar for lunch every day. I don't have 2 bowls of ice cream after dinner. What did we do to lose everything in the crashing job market? I know my mom told me not to go into typewriter repair, but I thought that might be a good business. I actually had a friend whose dad was a typewriter repairman. Retired as a typewriter repairman. You think, what's a typewriter? That's what some of you are thinking. I learned on a manual typewriter. Click, 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 click. You had to really push down. Some people say we follow God's plan for rearing our children and then turn their backs on God and on us. Wait, God, you promised. You said. Can we just admit, sometimes we think like this? So, this is when we learn something about complaining in the Psalms. Because the psalmist complains, but even while he's complaining, he finds his footing by remembering God's faithfulness, by renewing his own promise to follow the Lord, and by simply asking God for help. Because, this is point number 2, it is to God to whom we must turn when life becomes overwhelming. It's the devil, it's the slanderer who's saying into your ears, do not trust him, do not turn to him. When in reality, that's the only place you can go. If you seek help any other place, it's false hope. If you seek refuge under any other rock, it's the rock that will destroy you. The only place you can turn is God. And so we have then a hopeful remembrance. Remind yourself what God has done for you. Verse 1, we've heard with our ears, our fathers have told us what work you did in their days, in the times of old, how you drove out the heathen with your hand and planted them in the land, how you did afflict those people and cast them out, how they got not the land by their possession in their own sword, by their own arm, but rather by your right hand and your arm, and the light of your countenance, because you had favor to them. This is what the psalmist is doing, is reminding himself and the people of what God has done for them in the past. This is the whole series we're doing here and looking at the story of Israel in the Psalms. And we find here that God had demonstrated himself faithful in times past, of how God rescued the people out of Egypt and how he put them into the promised land and how they literally obtained the promised land, where they had houses that they didn't build and orchards that they didn't plant and fields of grain that they didn't farm. The psalmist was losing what was originally part of God's blessing. God drove out the enemies. God gave them the land by his power. God gave them his favor. And see, the psalmist has been saying, this is what I am losing. But now, by beginning the psalm this way, he's beginning with this statement: I know what God has done before. And this is what we must do. You have to, when you get to a place where life is overwhelming, say, but hasn't God been faithful to you in the past? If you can't answer that in the affirmative, then you need to really stop and evaluate your relationship with God. Because every Christian should be able to say, God has been with me all the way. He's been by my side through thick and thin, good times and bad. The psalmist can say, look at all that God has done for them and for us and for our people. And this remembrance is what brings hope to his heart. And so when in the hospital room or in the boss's office hearing the bad news about your job, or in the principal's office hearing the bad news about your kids, wherever you are in life, at that moment, that's when you remind yourself, I don't have a God who's forgotten me. I have a God who stood with me. That's when you rush off to Hobby Lobby and buy the Footprints in the Sand poem poster. Put it on your wall, right? That's when, letter B, you come up with a confident promise. You renew your promise to follow the Lord. Verse 4, you're my king. You're my king, O God. I love that word king in Hebrew, melech. Now you know Hebrew word, melech. Isn't it fun when you read Ruth? Do you remember Ruth's her father-in-law? What was his name? Elimelech. Eli. That's God. God is my king. That's what Elimelech's name meant. God is my king. Elimelech. Oh, wait. What did Elimelech do? There's famine in the land. We got to run. We're going to get out. We're going to go to another land. God's my king, but he's really not my king. At that moment, you say, no, I'm under all this pressure. There's famine in the land. There's destruction all around me. In our case, that would be like really losing your job or not being able to find a good job that provides for your family, something like that. It's real easy to say, okay, God, you promised, and to get that frustration. But now in this moment, what the psalmist is saying, no, I will renew to God my promise and my vow to him. I'm your servant. You're my king. I will follow you. God is still the leader. The only way I can push down my enemies is through you, verse 5. The only way we can tread them under is through your name. So, how easy it is to trust in the bow and the sword to save, but I will not do that. You save me from my enemies. You put them to shame that hated us. We will boast in you all the day long. We will praise your name forever. And so you're vowing that God is still your leader. He's the one who saves you from your enemies. He's the one that conquers your enemies. It's not by your own will, by your own strength, by your own ingenuity, by your own power. It is through him only. And as he's doing this for you, you praise him. We boast about you. We worship you. This is what he says. And this is what we have to do. When we feel overwhelmed and we want to blame God for our problems, we have to stop. Even as we're remembering what God has done for us in the past, we have to just commit again to the very truths that's basic to the Christian life. Lord, it's only through you that we are anything. It's only through you that we've survived any of this. It's only by your hand and by your help. You can have two outcomes to your life. Which one do you want? Generally speaking, all of us will die in a hospital. Maybe not in a hospital, maybe at home, but hospital or home, it's a hospital at home, so no. And you can die bitter and angry and frustrated and feeling all the loss of earth on your head. Even as a Christian, you can die that way. Or you can die with your children and your grandchildren standing around you singing, "Blessed be the name of the Lord." Which way do you want to go? How do you want to meet Christ as you close your eyes in death? The songwriter said, "And when I come to die, give me Jesus." You only get to that kind of thing when you teach yourself and teach your children and teach your grandchildren the truth that it's always about renewing that promise to the Lord even when difficult times come. I'm going to renew my promise to God. Lord, you're my king. You're my ruler. You're my leader. You're my God. And even when things happen that are awful and terrible, I still worship you. I still boast about you. You're the testimony that I give. And so if you are at the end of your life in a wheelchair, hardly able to hold up your head, being fed because you can't feed yourself, being changed because you can't take care of yourself, and your lips still move, the words from your lips ought to still be, "Praise God, from whom all blessings flow." And you only get there when right now, today, in the problems you have now, that's your testimony. You won't do then what you won't do now. And so the way to get there is a needed prayer. Seek his help when things get hard, when they get difficult. Verse 23, "Awake, don't sleep, Lord. Arise, do not cast us off." Verse 26, "Arise for our help. Redeem us for your mercy's sake." You see, find here prayer's acknowledgement. If we're to get past this, Lord, you have to do it. Only you can solve this problem. You alone have the answer. And so prayer in its acknowledgement comes to God again and say, God, if you sleep, I have no hope. If you cast us off, I have no hope. So arise, Lord, and help me. You gain the victory. You redeem me. That's prayer's plea. Rescue us again because of your steadfast love, because of your loyal love, your chesed love. Redeem me again. Rescue me again. As you did our forefathers, do it for us. A couple of years ago, Becky and I were in Spain. We were in the Mediterranean Sea. And I had a thought one day, and I've never been able to shake this thought. I was looking out into the Mediterranean Sea, and I thought to myself, do you know the Apostle Paul was in this water? It's kind of like going somewhere and seeing a little sign that says, George Washington slept here. Oh, that's pretty neat. I'm not planning to sleep here, but George did. All right, that's pretty cool. Or you go up and say, Abraham Lincoln practiced law here. You get to Springfield, Illinois. Here's this house, and it's like 200 square feet. They were small back then, really small. And you just go, okay, that's pretty neat. Here you have a place, you say, Paul swam here. They put a little plaque. And you think about all the times Paul, through the shipwrecks, was bobbing up and down in the Mediterranean Sea. It's cold waters splashing his face. The ship he had been on wrecked. In the case at the end of Acts, his final shipwreck that we know of, he's bobbing up and down on maybe a little piece of wood as he's slowly swimming towards land. And I looked at the Mediterranean Sea and said, Paul was in that water. I'm on this boat. I'm happy I'm on the boat. I have this weird penchant for doing things when I have thoughts like this. And so the thought was, I should jump over and see what it's like. Then your reality hits you and go, that would be a bad idea. Bad idea. So I didn't do that, but I'm thinking, looking over the side, I wonder what that's like. To bob, just to be kind of stranded. And as I'm doing that, I'm thinking to myself, what do you think he's saying? I don't deserve this. I didn't do anything for this. Why have you brought me here, God? Well, we could have said that. But instead, you can just see Paul. Okay, Lord, I've been here before. I've been in this water. I know this pool pretty well. Okay, Lord. Yeah, you've got a plan for me. You're still my leader. I'm still going to praise you. It's okay, Lord. Save me. Rescue me. Help me here. Get to land. Let me get bitten by a snake. That's what happens next. Soon Paul will be in Rome and he'll be under house arrest. His life will be under constant threat. He will live in sparse, poverty-like conditions. He will face increasing scrutiny by unbelievers and questions even from believers. Did you know in Paul's day, the question a lot of Christians had about Paul? So think, American Christianity, it's now all over social media. Here would have been the question about Paul. Why is he always in jail? What is wrong with you, man? Do you not look? Nobody else is in prison. You're always in jail. How do you think Paul feels? How would you feel? It's a dark and dreary day. But we can remind himself of God's blessings in the past and renew his promise to serve the Lord. And in the end, he can just pray. So how do you face the trouble of the times? How has he blessed you? Seriously, how has he blessed you? This is a preparation for Thanksgiving right here. List it out. Write it out. Take a piece of paper, get on your phone and get on the notes application and just type out all the thanksgiving you have. How has He blessed you and your family? And list them out all out. And you can go over that list and say, look what God has done. And now, will you then renew your promise and say, okay, Lord, I'll be faithful to you, even if this is where you put me, even if I'm going to go through this trial or this crisis, and maybe it's the family, and maybe it's the money, and maybe it's your health, and it doesn't really matter because, Lord, I'm just going to renew my promise to you. So when I'm in that hospital room talking to the doctor, it's not going to be out of anger, but out of real love for his soul because I'm thinking about him, because I know really I'm here because God wanted me here today. And I'm just going to renew my promise to the Lord. How will you do that? And saying, God, whatever you want for me is fine. And then will you pray? Will you take it to the Lord in prayer? And will you remind yourself that you have a friend in Jesus like no other, who all your sorrows and griefs will share and will bear. And so you take it to Him in prayer. That's how the hymn writer put it. And so I guess maybe my mom had the right answer, didn't she, after all? We're sitting in the car, and it's stalled in the middle of the road. Please, Lord, let the car start. Please, Lord, let the car start. That's the prayer. And it started. Great news. We didn't get run over. But you just take it to the Lord. Please, Lord, if it be your will, we bring this to you and ask you to help. Let's pray together. Father,